Amtrak's passenger trains link many of America's biggest cities. Amtrak takes you through diverse landscapes and can be an easy link from where you are to where you're going. Unfortunately, there are large gaps in the Amtrak map of the 48 contiguous states, with major cities and even entire states left out. However, Amtrak used to go to more places, on lines that have been discontinued for one reason or another. Let's look at these former trains, to see where Amtrak used to go and how the network has evolved or devolved over the years. First, some parameters to keep in mind so this video doesn't take 3 hours. Amtrak began in 1971, when it took over several regional services. At that time, and forever since, routes have been canceled, revived, rerouted, shortened, lengthened, renamed, combined, and had stops added or removed. Amtrak's network of throughway buses has also seen similar changes, and you can ride those, but only if you have a ticket for a connecting train. Finally, some regional train companies elected not to, or were not invited to, join Amtrak in 1971. Some did later, some never did and continue outside of Amtrak or have themselves shut down. And this doesn't even touch on the myriad regional private and/or state-run services that have existed at various times from the 1800s through today. So, to keep this focused, we'll restrict ourselves to former Amtrak trains and only the ones that went to places that are no longer possible on Amtrak today. When Amtrak speaks of expansion in the future, it's often with an eye to reviving these former services. So, where did you used to be able to go on Amtrak? Let's start in the eastern United States. From 1986 to 96, if you wanted to travel to Cape Cod in Massachusetts, you could take Amtrak's Cape Codder. This weekend service sent 2 trains in either direction to and from New York City, although one train began in Washington, D.C. The Cape Codder followed the Northeast Corridor, still used for several Amtrak trains, but passengers would change at Attleboro, Massachusetts, to an existing tourist railroad to Hyannis on Cape Cod. The trip took 6.5 hours. The Cape Codder was altered significantly over the years, and by the end was operating between Boston and Hyannis. It went through Providence, and passengers coming from elsewhere could transfer there to get to the Cape. But they didn't. In 1996, fewer than 2,000 people total used this infrequent service, and the train was discontinued. Hopefully one day it will be revived. Welcome back, Codder. Parkersburg, West Virginia has twice been served by Amtrak trains. In 1971, apparently due to pressure from West Virginian politicians, Amtrak revived the old pre-Amtrak West Virginian service, linking Washington, D.C. with Parkersburg. Amtrak experimented with a high-speed train called Turbo Train to see how it could handle the mountainous terrain. And for this, the West Virginia was renamed the Potomac Turbo. Soon the regular train was brought back, and the route was renamed again, this time as Potomac Special. Whatever you call it, it was discontinued in 1973 after less than 2 years. But later in 1976, Amtrak began the Shenandoah on the same route, again from Washington, D.C. and going to Parkersburg, but this time continuing across southern Ohio to Cincinnati. This train, taking nearly 15 hours and eventually running as an overnight sleeper, was discontinued in 1981. With Amtrak considering it a particularly unpopular route. Today, you can still get a train from Washington to Cincinnati on the Cardinal, but it only runs 3 times a week, whereas both services involving Parkersburg were daily. Most of northern West Virginia is currently inaccessible on Amtrak. You used to be able to go between Chicago and Newport News, Virginia on the James Whitcomb Riley. You can still travel between those destinations, but you'd have to go up to Washington and transfer there, because the direct section between Charlottesville and Richmond is defunct, a small change on the map with big implications for travelers. Going east from Chicago, part of the James Whitcomb Riley used to split off at Ashland, Kentucky. This was called the Mountaineer, and went through far southern West Virginia to Petersburg, across Virginia to Norfolk. The James Whitcomb Riley and the Mountaineer were both discontinued in 1977. The former became the Cardinal, but without the Newport News part, and the Mountaineer was partially revived as the Hilltopper, now connecting Catlettsburg, Virginia with Washington, D.C. At this point, Norfolk was only reachable by bus, and anyway, the Hilltopper itself was discontinued in 1979. Northeast regional trains now reach both Newport News and Norfolk, but there is no longer any Amtrak train service from one side of southern Virginia to the other, nor in far southern West Virginia. Until 1995, you could take Amtrak's Broadway Limited between New York and Chicago. This is a route that Amtrak continued when it took over in 1971. The Broadway Limited actually began in 1912. Over the years, Amtrak made some changes, including at one point rerouting it through Akron, Ohio. The Broadway Limited took 16 hours from end to end, but service was stopped in 1995. The current, less direct route between New York and Chicago, the Lakeshore Limited, goes through Buffalo in northern New York State and takes several more hours than Broadway Limited did. Kansas City, St. Louis, Indianapolis, Pittsburgh, all major American cities, but there's no longer a simple way to move between them on Amtrak. That's because the National Limited was discontinued in 1979. This route linked Kansas City to Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, where it split to serve New York and Washington, D.C. And it was clearly a good idea, being a continuation of successful pre-Amtrak routes. But deteriorating track conditions caused frequent delays and cancellations, and in 1979, the Midwest lost one of its major passenger train services. Central Ohio was particularly hard hit, and now the only way for riders to get between the Midwest and the Northeast is an out-of-the-way side trip to Chicago and a likely inconvenient transfer. You could argue that Amtrak's most egregious blank spot is in the South. Pretty much everywhere east of the Mississippi River is populated to some degree, but you wouldn't know it from the train map. Kentucky and Tennessee are hardly touched, and that means Nashville has no Amtrak service. You'd think that a train between Nashville and Atlanta at least would be a no-brainer. Well, for many decades there was something in the area, although even it didn't involve Atlanta. Amtrak in 1971 established a service called South Wind from Chicago to Florida. It was based on a similar existing route with the same name. Amtrak renamed South Wind the Floridian that same year. Southbound, the Floridian left Chicago and took a steady southeast course through Louisville, Kentucky, and, yes, Nashville. It continued south through Birmingham, Alabama, and skirted along southern Georgia to Jacksonville. There it split, with some cars going to St. Petersburg on the Gulf Coast and others going down to Miami. And of course the same in reverse if going north. Passengers going the distance would spend 2 nights aboard this daily train. But again, bad track conditions disrupted service on the Floridian a bit too much, and the service was discontinued in the big 1979 downgrade of Amtrak. Thus, Nashville and Louisville lost their Amtrak service. Some of the tracks once used by the Floridian are now abandoned, not even used for freight. Amtrak did reopen part of the route in late 1999. The Kentucky Cardinal established the Chicago and Louisville connection once again, this time going through Indianapolis. Depending on the day of the week, the Kentucky Cardinal either ran as part of the Cardinal between Chicago and Indianapolis, splitting with or joining it there, or did the entire route by itself when the Cardinal wasn't scheduled. The Kentucky Cardinal often crept along at a snail's pace, sometimes 30 miles an hour, much slower than people could drive themselves. It was discontinued in 2003, and Louisville was once again left out in the cold. Also in the South is one of Amtrak's most notorious gaps, the stretch between New Orleans and Jacksonville. Amtrak chose not to continue the existing Gulf Wind between those two cities in 1971, although they did bring the New Orleans to Mobile section back for several months in the mid-80s as the Gulf Coast Limited. Later in 1989, the Gulf Breeze service began as a section of the Crescent from New York. Gulf Breeze split from the Crescent in Birmingham and went south through Montgomery on its way to Mobile. But the Gulf Breeze ended in 1995, cutting off Montgomery once again. But by that time, actually back in 1993, the Sunset Limited between Los Angeles and New Orleans had been extended. Now it included the section to Jacksonville and the route to Miami used by the Silver Meteor. Finally, America had a true coast-to-coast train. So communities along the Gulf of Mexico were better served, but elsewhere, the Sunset Limited was rerouted away from Phoenix, leaving another major American city with no direct rail access on Amtrak. Plus, the endpoint was scaled back from Miami to Orlando. But the event that disrupted Sunset Limited the most was Hurricane Katrina in 2005. The route was suspended between San Antonio, Texas and Florida following the storm. A few months later, the section through eastern Texas and Louisiana to New Orleans was restored, but the route east of that was left out of service. It's regarded as one of Amtrak's most frustrating gaps in its network. Amtrak in Texas has seen its share of changes over the years. In 1973, a train called the Inter-American connected Fort Worth and Laredo on the Mexican border. The next year, the Inter-American was extended to St. Louis, and 2 years after that, all the way to Chicago. Sadly, fortunes were fading in eastern Texas for Amtrak. In 1979, the Inter-American was merged with another service called Lone Star, which connected Chicago and Houston via Oklahoma. The new merged route, also called Inter-American, kept the handy split-off line from Temple, Texas to Houston. But in 1981, the section between San Antonio and Laredo was ended, as was the Temple to Houston part. The route was renamed Eagle and still runs today as the Texas Eagle. Laredo is still left out. Something else was left out when the Lone Star was merged with the Inter-American in 1979. The Lone Star, formerly known as the Texas Chief, had gone through Fort Worth up through Oklahoma City and Wichita, Kansas, on its way to Chicago. After the merging, the section north of Fort Worth was completely abandoned in favor of the easterly route through Dallas and then Arkansas. Now thankfully, the Fort Worth to Oklahoma City section at least was reconstituted in 1999 as the Heartland Flyer, and it still exists today. North of that though, Amtrak train service has not been restored. Sorry, Wichita. Another example of a small Amtrak change having a big effect on sensible train travel in the U.S. is the demise of the River Cities route. From 1984 until 1993, this service connected Kansas City with New Orleans. On its journey, it would twice join other trains. Between Kansas City and St. Louis, River Cities trains would be part of one of Amtrak's mule trains. The Kansas City Mule if going west towards Kansas City, and the St. Louis Mule if going east towards St. Louis. Between St. Louis and Carbondale, Illinois, it would be on its own. From Carbondale to New Orleans, it would join with Amtrak's City of New Orleans. River Cities was a daily service, taking 22 hours. When it was canceled in 1993, an Amtrak Thruway bus was added between St. Louis and Carbondale. So, you could still do something like the River Cities by piecing together two trains and the bus, but since Amtrak no longer uses the short section of track between St. Louis and Centralia, to ride the entire way by train you'd have to take another inconvenient excursion to Chicago and figure it out from there. As for Chicago, it's long been a major, perhaps the major, rail hub in America, certainly in the Midwest, and even now there are Amtrak trains that start and end in Chicago that can take you in all kinds of different directions. But Chicago used to have even more options in the Amtrak era. Thank you very much to everybody who's subscribing to my free weekly email newsletter, and to my supporters on Patreon. Special thanks to Will Phillips and Omeyer. Nowadays, you can take either the Lakeshore Limited or the Capital Limited between Toledo, Ohio and Chicago. You can also take the Wolverine to Detroit and then up to Pontiac, Michigan. But for 24 years, from 1980 until 2004, you could ride Amtrak's Lake Cities service, which stretched from Chicago to Detroit but then down to Toledo directly. This segment offered a much simpler way to get between Detroit and all the major eastern cities. Michigan riders could change at Toledo and not have to involve Chicago at all. That trip along Lake Erie between Detroit and Toledo was slow, however, and ridership suffered. When the segment was closed in 2004, Amtrak had been losing over $800,000 a year on it. You can now go direct between Detroit and Toledo on an Amtrak Thruway bus, but it's not really the same, is it? To do it all by train, again, you'd have to backtrack to Chicago. Speaking of Chicago and Michigan, today there's a train called Blue Water, part of the group of routes called Michigan Services, that takes you between Chicago and Port Huron. It began in 1974 as the Blue Water Limited, but in 1982 the service was extended across the border into Canada and all the way to Toronto. This new route was renamed the International Limited in honor of a pre-Amtrak route that had been called that. The name was soon shortened to just International. The benefits of a simple rail link between Chicago and Toronto can easily be imagined. Sadly, increased border checks after 9/11 and various issues with freight trains impacted international ridership, and the Canada portion was discontinued in 2004. Again, the train went no further than Port Huron, and its name reverted to Blue Water. You can still go by Amtrak between Chicago and Toronto, but you have to take a series of 2 trains routed through Buffalo and New York. More hassle and taking twice as long as the International used to. A pair of shorter routes used to link Chicago with points to the northwest. From 1974 to 1981, the Black Hawk went between Chicago and Dubuque, Iowa, often with a full dining car and a domed observation car. This passenger service is scheduled to resume in the near future, but not under Amtrak. In April 2000, a train called Lake Country Limited began between Chicago and Janesville, Wisconsin. It was part of an ambitious planned network of smaller Amtrak routes mixing passenger service with things like mail service. The idea wasn't seen through, though, and the Lake Country Limited was shut down after a year and a half. In 1975, Amtrak revived an older route called Gopher that connected Minneapolis and Duluth, Minnesota. Amtrak called it the Arrowhead, and at first it was actually a daily train between Minneapolis and Superior, Wisconsin that made no stops between. A bus would take passengers the rest of the way to Duluth. Soon some stops along the way were added and the train was allowed through to Duluth, eliminating the need for the bus. It all changed in 1978, when the Arrowhead was suspended in favor of a new service called North Star. This was a sleeper train between Chicago and Duluth, now routed through St. Paul rather than Minneapolis. In 1981, the North Star was scaled back to run just between St. Paul and Duluth, and its schedule wasn't coordinated with the Empire Builder, so there was no longer an efficient and simple way to go between Duluth and Chicago. The North Star, owing to the usual budget problems, was discontinued in 1985, and currently Duluth is only reachable on Amtrak via a bus connection. Finally, there are 3 legendary long-distance routes in the western part of the U.S. that no longer run and whose absence leaves the largest empty spots on the Amtrak map. First of all, Chicago and Seattle. Currently, and since 1929, the Empire Builder links the two, running through the Twin Cities of Minnesota, through North Dakota and remote northern Montana, and across Washington state. A spur line, incidentally, can take you to or from Portland instead of Seattle. But in the 1970s, one of Amtrak's most beautiful routes took a different tack to the south, one that also helpfully connected several of Montana's larger cities like Billings, Bozeman, and Missoula. This was the famed North Coast Hiawatha, a revival of beloved pre-Amtrak train services. At first, the North Coast Hiawatha was a sort of subsection of the Empire Builder, breaking off between Spokane, Washington, and Fargo, North Dakota. Soon it was extended, first all the way to Chicago on one end, and then to Seattle on the other, on a different route across Washington than Empire Builder. North Coast Hiawatha gave riders great views, service to different parts of especially Montana and North Dakota, and easier access to Yellowstone National Park. But it was losing money, and in 1979, after some negotiation and controversy, it was removed from Amtrak's schedule. Not even Amtrak Thruway buses serve these vast regions now. There was actually a third way to travel between Seattle and Chicago for many years. In 1977, Amtrak began its Pioneer service, which went south from Seattle, going through Portland, Oregon, and then east through Boise, Idaho, and to Salt Lake City. 4 years later, Pioneer cars started linking in Ogden, Utah with trains on the San Francisco Zephyr. Thus, you could take an unbroken ride to and from Chicago on Pioneer. At this time, the San Francisco Zephyr, and thus the Pioneer, went up into Wyoming, including Cheyenne, on the way to Denver. In 1983, the Wyoming section was cut when the San Francisco Zephyr was renamed California Zephyr and rerouted to a more southern line between Denver and Salt Lake City. In 1991, the Wyoming section was revived for the Pioneer, and the through train cooperation with California Zephyr now happened between Chicago and Denver. Finally, in 1997, the Pioneer was discontinued once and for all. This means that eastern Oregon, virtually all of Idaho, and all of Wyoming are no longer served by Amtrak trains. Lastly, there's the Desert Wind, or there was the Desert Wind. One of Amtrak's most notorious and frustrating gaps, similar to Nashville, is the lack of service to and from Las Vegas, Nevada. In the heyday of American Rail, there had been service there, of course, but Amtrak declined to continue it when it took over in 1971. It was a glaring omission, though, and Amtrak made various brief attempts to connect to Las Vegas again. Finally, in 1979, facing political pressure, Amtrak established the Desert Wind, which ran between Los Angeles and Ogden, Utah. Thus, Las Vegas service was restored, as well as points up and down western Utah. At first, the Desert Wind was timed for connections with the San Francisco Zephyr, and then it began actually physically joining that train in Utah. So, passengers could now ride between Los Angeles, or Las Vegas, and Chicago without changing trains. For a time, by the way, the segment between Chicago and Utah was carrying San Francisco Zephyr, Pioneer, and Desert Wind cars all together, yielding Amtrak's longest trains, with the exception of the endless auto train. Desert Wind was discontinued in 1997, again for budgetary reasons, and thus Las Vegas was removed from Amtrak train schedules indefinitely. So, while never even close to comprehensive, Amtrak's train network isn't even what it once was. Major cities like Nashville, Las Vegas, and Phoenix are left out. Others like Atlanta and Salt Lake City are terribly underserved. Wyoming isn't served at all. Idaho barely is, and it's far north. South Dakota, with its 2 national parks and nearly 1 million people, has never been served by Amtrak trains. And while the gaps in the map are obvious, the lack of quick routes between cities that are on Amtrak lines can be just as maddening. Notice that in the huge region of the country between Chicago and California, there are virtually no north-south lines, no direct route between Billings and Salt Lake City, Cheyenne and Albuquerque, Flagstaff and Denver, Omaha and Minneapolis, The list goes on and on and on of routes that would be handy. Of course, I'm sure Amtrak would love to greatly expand their passenger train services. It's not like there aren't any train lines. The U.S. freight network is extensive, and this is far from a complete map of it. But there are difficult considerations, like the leasing of freight tracks, building or refurbishing stations or tracks, finding staff and new train cars, and ultimately, issues of revenue and funding and public interest in rail service. Ultimately, I think Amtrak will grow, and the more they're encouraged to, the more they will fill in the gaps. The way to encourage them is to ride current Amtrak trains. They need to see the money, and to see the willingness of people to get around car-centric America by rail. So let's hope that this video becomes out of date, and that many of the services mentioned will be restarted, with many new ones added. Until then, I'll be checking out some of Amtrak's current routes, because train travel anywhere is an enjoyable and eye-opening way to explore new parts of the landscape. Thanks for watching. Here's to the future of passenger trains in America. See you on the rails.